midnight on Capitol Hill when the air shifted. The corridors were still lit, but the building felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. Reporters lingered outside closed doors, refreshing feeds, whispering rumors, waiting for the kind of story that changes careers. Inside, Lauren Boebert stood alone, her phone vibrating against the desk. One name flashed on the screen: Trump. Across the country, alerts exploded at the same moment. A presidential veto had just landed, killing a $1 billion Colorado water project with a single signature. For rural towns, it was a gut punch. For farmers, it was panic. For Republican hardliners back home, it felt personal. And for Boebert, the timing was impossible to ignore. Cameras clicked. Text messages poured in. Donors asked questions they had never asked before. Had she crossed a line? Had she forgotten how loyalty works in this movement? Outside the chamber, reporters shouted her name, sensing blood in the water. This wasn't just another policy dispute. This was retaliation, whispered the aides. This was punishment, said the headlines forming in real time. The reason sat like a live wire in the room. Jeffrey Epstein. A name America wanted buried, sealed, forgotten. Files that were supposed to stay locked. Transparency that was never meant to happen. Boebert had pushed anyway, voting to pry open records powerful people hoped would never see daylight. And now, the former president was pushing back. He built a movement on loyalty, on obedience, on never breaking ranks in public. He rewarded allies and crushed defectors, and everyone in Washington knew the rules. But tonight those rules were being enforced against one of his own. A MAGA congresswoman, suddenly cast as a warning. On social media, the narrative hardened by the second. Some called her reckless. Others called her brave. Clips replayed of Trump praising transparency years earlier, clashing violently with his silence now. The contradiction was impossible to miss. The tension was impossible to escape. Boebert stared at her phone, knowing this call wasn't about water policy or budgets. It was about power. It was about fear. It was about whether truth had a place in a movement built on loyalty above all else. And as the phone kept buzzing, one question echoed through the Capitol and far beyond it. Would she back down, or would she do the unthinkable? Because what Boebert did next would change everything. The Epstein files matter because they sit at the intersection of power, secrecy, and a public that has learned the hard way what silence usually protects. For years, Americans were told the truth would come later, that investigations were ongoing, that justice takes time. But time passed, names stayed hidden, and trust eroded. What began as a criminal case slowly transformed into a symbol of everything people fear about elite immunity. At its core, this fight was never just about one disgraced financier. It was about whether the system tells the truth only when it's convenient. The Epstein files represent unanswered questions, sealed records, and relationships powerful people would rather keep buried. Every redaction felt like a reminder that there are two sets of rules in America, one for ordinary citizens, and one for those with influence. That tension exploded into politics when lawmakers introduced the Epstein Files Transparency Act. On paper, it was simple. Release the documents. Let the public see what the government knows. Let accountability replace rumor. But simplicity is dangerous in Washington. The bill cracked open a fault line that runs through both parties, pitting transparency against protection, and conscience against career survival. Unexpectedly, the issue broke through partisan walls. Progressives framed it as a moral reckoning. Libertarians called it a test of government honesty. Even conservative voters, long trained to distrust institutions, demanded answers. Polls showed overwhelming support for disclosure, not because Americans are obsessed with scandal, but because they are exhausted by secrecy. They wanted proof that the powerful are not untouchable. Online, the pressure became impossible to ignore. Hashtags surged. Old clips resurfaced. Every contradiction was screenshotted, every deflection mocked. People remembered past promises about draining swamps and exposing corruption. They noticed who suddenly went quiet. The internet, relentless and unforgiving, turned the Epstein files into a cultural mirror, reflecting who still believed in sunlight and who preferred shadows. Cable news followed, then talk radio, then town halls. Voters asked questions representatives weren't prepared to answer. Donors hesitated. Staffers panicked. The issue refused to stay contained, refusing to be labeled left or right. It spread because it tapped into something deeper, a shared frustration with systems that always seemed to protect themselves first. For immigrants, young voters, and communities historically shut out of power, this moment felt familiar. Promises made, accountability delayed, truth rationed. Transparency wasn't abstract to them. It was personal. It was about whether their voices mattered as much as the names behind closed doors. That's where resistance hardened. Trump allies dismissed the push as a distraction, a hoax, a weaponized narrative designed to weaken loyalty. They warned Republicans not to fracture the base, not to hand ammunition to opponents. Behind closed doors, the message was clearer. Unity mattered more than disclosure. Silence was being reframed as strength. But for the public, silence sounded like guilt. Every delay fed suspicion. Every veto, every dismissal, every attempt. In this chapter of the story, Donald Trump is no longer just a former president hovering over the party like a ghost of elections past. He becomes something sharper, more dangerous, a power broker willing to wound his own allies to protect what must not be exposed. This is not about ideology. This is about control, loyalty, and fear. For years, Trump cultivated an image as a truth-teller, a wrecking ball aimed at elite secrecy. He promised transparency, hinted at hidden lists, and flirted with the idea that powerful networks would finally be exposed. That rhetoric resonated deeply with voters who felt lied to and locked out. But when the Epstein files moved from rumor to legislation, the tone changed. What once sounded like courage began to look like hesitation. Trump's history with Epstein is messy, public, and inconvenient. Photos, quotes, and overlapping social circles have lived on the internet for years, resurfacing whenever silence grows too loud. Sometimes Trump distanced himself. Other times he minimized the relationship. On transparency, his stance zigzagged, praising openness in one moment and dismissing the issue as a distraction in the next. To supporters paying attention, the contradictions were jarring. Behind the scenes, the pressure began quietly. Phone calls. Messages passed through intermediaries. Warnings framed as advice. Lauren Boebert, insiders say, was urged to rethink her position, to remember who the real enemy was, to stop feeding a narrative that could fracture the base. Loyalty was invoked not as a request, but as a debt. When persuasion failed, consequences followed. The veto landed like a thunderclap. A Colorado water project, years in the making, erased with a stroke of a pen. Officially, it was about spending. Politically, it looked like a message. Defy the line, and you pay a price. Rural communities felt abandoned. Local leaders were blindsided. And Boebert was left standing in the blast radius. Publicly, Trump brushed off accusations of retaliation. Privately, the signal was unmistakable. The movement demanded unity, and unity meant silence. The same leader who once mocked political machines now wielded one with precision. The same voice that praised fighters now punished defiance. This is where the villain takes shape, not as a caricature, but as a study in contradiction. A man who rose by attacking corruption now resisting disclosure. A figure who claimed to stand with outsiders now enforcing insider rules. A leader who built loyalty through rebellion now demanding obedience through fear. Supporters struggled to reconcile the shift. Some rationalized it as strategy. Others insisted there must be reasons the public didn't understand. But each justification required ignoring the pattern. Transparency was welcome until it threatened proximity. Truth was valuable until it risked collateral damage. The political calculus was cold. Releasing files meant uncertainty. Uncertainty meant risk. And risk, to a leader obsessed with control, is intolerable. Better to frame the issue as a distraction. Better to accuse opponents of weaponization. Better to make an example of someone who forgot the rules. In doing so, Trump revealed the limits of his movement's promise. The rebellion had boundaries. The swamp could be drained, but not if the pipes led too close to home. Accountability was celebrated, but only when it pointed outward. Lauren Boebert did not arrive in Washington polished, pre-approved, or shaped by elite institutions. She came from the edges of political power, from rural Colorado towns where politics is not theoretical and government decisions are felt in water pressure, gas prices, and whether a business survives the winter. Her rise was fueled by defiance long before it was fueled by ambition. She learned early that waiting for permission meant waiting forever. Before cable news panels and viral clips, Boebert built her identity in communities that felt ignored, mocked, and dismissed. Places where people fixed their own problems because help rarely arrives on time. That environment shaped her instincts. Speak plainly. Fight directly. Distrust systems that promise everything and deliver nothing. When she entered politics, she carried that posture with her, unfiltered and unapologetic. In Congress, she quickly earned a reputation as a firebrand, someone unafraid to disrupt decorum or challenge leadership. Critics labeled her reckless. Supporters called her authentic. What both sides agreed on was this: she was not easy to control. She voted with the party often, but never quietly. And when she disagreed loudly. That independence became central to how she saw herself. Not as a loyal foot soldier, but as a representative whose first obligation was to the people who sent her there. That distinction matters in moments like this. Because when the Epstein Files Transparency Act surfaced, Boebert did not see a political trap. She saw a test. Her support for transparency was not born from strategy. It came from something simpler and more dangerous in Washington: consistency. She had spent years talking about corruption, elite immunity, and a justice system that treats ordinary people harshly while shielding the powerful. Backing away now would have required admitting those words were branding, not belief. Privately, advisors warned her. This was not the hill to die on. The files were radioactive. The timing was wrong. The leadership was watching. But Boebert kept returning to the same question. If not now, then when? If not this, then what? Accountability delayed is accountability denied, and she knew her voters understood that instinctively. When news broke of the veto and the pressure campaign, something unexpected happened. Messages flooded her phone, not from Washington insiders, but from home. Farmers. Small business owners. Veterans. Parents. They told her to stand firm. They said they were proud. They reminded her why she ran in the first place. In a political culture obsessed with donors and endorsements, that support carried a different weight. Online, the reaction fractured expectations. Progressives who had never defended her before acknowledged the courage of her stand. Immigrant advocates praised the principle even if they rejected her politics elsewhere. Young voters shared clips, not as praise of ideology, but as recognition of backbone. In a moment defined by secrecy, clarity cut through. Trump's response did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one stronger, louder, more punishing than the last. First were the words. Public statements brushing off the Epstein files as a distraction, a so-called Democrat hoax designed to weaken the movement. The language was familiar, dismissive, confident. To loyalists, it sounded like leadership. To skeptics, it sounded like avoidance. Then came the amplification. Truth Social erupted with posts attacking the bill, attacking the media, and attacking anyone who refused to fall in line. Allies echoed the talking points within hours. Cable segments followed. The message was disciplined and unmistakable. This fight was illegitimate, and those pushing it were helping the enemy. Behind closed doors, the pressure sharpened. Calls were made. Meetings were requested. Warnings were delivered politely at first, then less so. Support the cause, or accept the consequences. Staffers whispered about donor pullbacks and committee punishments. The architecture of power began to move, quiet but relentless. The veto was the turning point. Strategically timed, surgically placed, it landed on Colorado like a hammer. Officials scrambled to explain. Rural communities demanded answers. Conservative radio hosts fumed. And everyone noticed who was caught in the crossfire. The message was no longer subtle. Defiance would be expensive. Colorado media descended on Boebert. Cameras followed her into hallways. Questions grew sharper. Was this worth it? Would she reconsider? Could she survive a prolonged war with Trump? Each interview became a test, each headline a countdown. She did not flinch. Standing before microphones, she rejected the framing outright. Transparency was not a hoax. Accountability was not partisan. And backing down, she said plainly, was not an option. This isn't over, she declared, a warning and a promise rolled into one sentence. Grassroots supporters responded instantly. Town halls filled. Messages poured in. People who had never donated before sent $5 with notes, saying thank you for standing firm. Others begged her to be careful, to protect herself, to think long term. The pressure came from every direction, but the loudest voices were the ones telling her not to bend. Leaks followed. Anonymous sources hinted at internal fury. Stories appeared describing tense meetings and fractured alliances. Conservative commentators debated whether Boebert had gone too far or not far enough. Progressives watched closely, surprised to find themselves rooting for resolve rather than retreat. The online war intensified. Clips of Boebert's statements spread alongside Trump's dismissals, stitched together in brutal contrast. One spoke of loyalty. The other spoke of truth. The audience chose sides, often loudly, often permanently. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds, reflecting a country arguing with itself in real time. Every escalation raised the stakes. Every attack made compromise harder. Trump's opposition grew more aggressive, more personal. Boebert's resistance grew more defined, more deliberate. Neither side blinked. Neither side backed down. What began as a dispute over documents had transformed into a test of power. Who decides what the public deserves to know? Who gets punished for asking? And how much pressure can one person withstand before the system wins? Lawmakers watched closely, recalculating their own positions in silence. Some erased draft statements. Others delayed interviews. Fear traveled faster than facts. The reaction hit like a shockwave the moment the confrontation crystallized. Social media did what it always does when power collides with defiance. It amplified everything. Clips looped endlessly. Quotes were frozen into screenshots. Hashtags surged to the top of trending lists, not for hours, but for days. Some framed Boebert as reckless. Others hailed her as fearless. But almost no one ignored her. Late-night hosts seized the moment. Monologues that usually skim headlines slowed down, leaning into the irony. Jokes landed harder because they carried an edge of truth. A movement built on rebellion was now punishing rebellion. Laughter filled studios, but the undertone was unmistakable. This wasn't just funny. It was revealing. Cable news followed with wall-to-wall coverage. Panels fractured along ideological lines, then fractured again within them. Conservative commentators argued openly, some defending Trump's authority, others quietly questioning it. Progressive voices, long critical of Boebert, surprised audiences by separating the person from the principle. Transparency, they said, should not be controversial. Accountability should not be optional. Celebrities entered the conversation, as they always do when politics crosses into culture. Some posted cautiously, praising the idea of truth without naming sides. Others were bolder, calling out the double standard, pointing to the danger of loyalty enforced by punishment. Each post carried millions of impressions, pushing the story beyond politics into the mainstream bloodstream. Opinion columns followed, sharper and more consequential. Writers described the moment as a tipping point, not just for the Epstein files, but for the identity of the Republican Party itself. Was MAGA a movement of outsiders challenging power, or had it become another hierarchy protecting itself? The question appeared again and again, framed differently but pointing to the same fracture. Inside conservative circles, the damage was more personal. Grassroots activists argued online, accusing each other of betrayal or blindness. Local party meetings grew tense. Some longtime supporters expressed confusion, unsure why transparency suddenly felt dangerous. Others doubled down, insisting unity mattered more than any single issue. The debate was no longer about Boebert alone. It was about what loyalty meant and who it served. For younger voters and politically engaged immigrants, the moment landed with particular force. Many had grown up skeptical of institutions, watching promises evaporate. Seeing an insider punished for demanding disclosure confirmed fears they already held. At the same time, watching her refuse to retreat offered something rare. Proof that resistance from within was still possible. Trump tried to stomp her career, but instead, he ignited a national reckoning. What was meant to be a warning became a spotlight. What was supposed to enforce silence forced a conversation the country had been avoiding for years. One vote, one refusal to back down, turned a political dispute into a test of character, power, and truth. This story matters because it asks something of all of us. Not whether we agree with every position or personality involved, but whether transparency is negotiable. Whether loyalty should outweigh accountability. Whether fear gets to decide what the public deserves to know. Moments like this don't just define politicians. They define movements. They define cultures. They define the expectations citizens carry into the future. Lauren Boebert didn't just challenge a former president. She challenged a system that assumes silence will always win. And regardless of where you stand politically, that challenge forces an uncomfortable question. If your career, your access, your future depended on staying quiet, would you still speak up? That question doesn't belong to Washington alone. It belongs to every workplace, every institution, every moment where truth carries a cost. Democracy survives not because courage is common, but because it appears often enough to remind us what's possible. Now, the conversation moves to you. If you're new on my official news YouTube channel, like my video. And also subscribe my official news channel.